silence is deafening this morning. And it's glad to see you out there in the shadows, but you're not the program this morning, so it's just as well. Thank you for coming again.
David, can you speak up?
Yep, I'll get closer to the mic. We are pleased that you've come again to hear some tall tales as we continue this program. I would remind you, as I have before, that we are always interested in continuing programs. So over on the piano is the little form that I mentioned earlier. If you would like to do a program, don't be shy. Just fill that out or contact me. Or if you want to put someone else on the spot to do a program, then you can put that information as well, and then we'll go from there. So, thank you. We're glad to see a full house again this morning, and we're pleased that you're here. This morning, we're going to have an exciting program, and I looked in the notebooks for residents to get a little more familiar with Jay Parsons, and the first paragraph of the little bio that's published in the Villager for new residents I thought was particularly interesting. It describes Jay. It says, on February 28, 2019, he moved into the Garden Homes. Because of his career choices, he has lived much of his life on the other side of the world. Perhaps one day he would be willing to do a Tall Tales program. Well, guess what? Today is the day. So, without trying to describe Jay and introduce him, the purpose of him is to tell his story to us. And so we'll count on him doing that and sharing his story with us, which I know is going to be very, very interesting. So with that, Jay, we welcome you this morning.
Thank you, Dave. Before I start, I'd really like to thank Ashley. I mean, we all thank Ashley. She made it possible for this whole presentation. She took all my pictures and put them on the, whatever you call that, PowerPoint. And she's been here cleaning up my mess, like tripping over wires and whatever. Thank you, Ashley. You're a gem. The title of my story today is My Life as a UN Bureaucrat. Now, how many of you speak French? So you know, en français, a bureaucrat is a homme de cuir, which literally translates as a leather bottom, from sitting so long. The other word for the United Nations is like that North Atlantic Treaty Organization that is our mutual defense pact with Europe. NATO, NATO. Well, NATO in the UN is no action, talk only. How many of you, please raise your hand, know what the United Nations is? Oh, wow, you are a very unusual group. Most Americans have no idea what the United Nations is. When I introduce myself or they ask me what have I done in my career, I said I work for the United Nations. Oh, we'd like to thank you for your service to your country. Well, yeah, I was a representative from the United States, but not as such to the United Nations. The United Nations is not a U.S. organization. It's not part of the State Department. It's a world body. Anyone know when the United Nations was created? Well, the late 1945, really, after World War II. What was the purpose of the United Nations initially, ideally? Prevent war, exactly. Provide a forum for the world to sit and talk as equals. Every nation in the world is represented in the United Nations. Every nation has an equal voice in the General Assembly. not in the Security Council, but in the General Assembly. Anyone, any state can get up and speak and tell their side of the story. Does anyone think the UN has a purpose? Does it do anything that's useful?
Yeah.
A lot of Americans think it's just a waste of money. They don't know when you send a letter internationally that it's the United Nations that brought the countries together to negotiate postage, international sending of mail and packages. Individual countries can't do that. Individual countries can't set up telecommunications. We have it, but if we want to talk from here to Europe, we need to have cooperation between countries. And it's the United Nations that really pulls countries together to work on common issues facing the world. Has anyone ever wondered what it's like to be a United Nations person? I was asked, well, just the other day, to say something about, people think, oh, well, if they know anything about the United Nations, it's this big, beautiful building on the East River in New York, and it's got all of, like last week, it had all of the heads of state of the world came to the UN to make a statement, and President Biden was there to speak on behalf of the US. It's a very diplomatic place. It's very prestigious. It's kind of upper class. It's something very special. Here I am, Jay Parsons, from Torrington, Connecticut, working in the United Nations. Well, I'm not anything particularly special. But someone asked me the other day, how did you get involved in the UN? Interesting story. I started as a teacher in Vietnam. I graduated from college, age 21, went to Vietnam to teach English in a boys' high school in central Vietnam, the former capital, imperial capital of Vietnam. That was my first taste of overseas life. Only time I'd ever been overseas was to go up to vacation in Canada. And that wasn't much of an overseas trip. But for a little boy from Torrington, Connecticut, that was pretty far. Anyway, my 2 years in Vietnam sort of kindled in me something that said, one, I want to come back and work in Asia. There's something about Asia that I was particularly attracted to. I wanted to work in some sort of an international capacity where I could do some good, and as President Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I was part of that generation. So I spent 2 years in Vietnam teaching, living with a Vietnamese family, learning to speak a little bit of Vietnamese, and came back really enthusiastic. And I thought, because I was there during the political struggle between the first president of Vietnam, President Diem, and the generals who ultimately overthrew him with US support, I thought, I'm going to go back to the US and study diplomacy, because I could see the role of the US government, the diplomats, in the life of Vietnam, the important role that they played. So I came back, got a master's degree in international relations, decided I didn't want that at all. And so I finally went back at one point to get a PhD in geography, of all things, from the University of Hawaii. Well, doing my doctoral research in the Philippines, I was studying the diffusion of family planning information. How did family planning information spread in a social space called a barrio, a village? And I became very interested in the issues of family planning and the problems that the people who were supposed to be served by the family planning program were having getting the services that they wanted from the program managers and from the government. The people wanted family planning. The government didn't think they really wanted them, and they had to be taught to want it. And I said, oh, there's a malfunction. Maybe I could work and help in that way. So I came back when I got my dissertation done, I graduated, and went for a year to Ann Arbor to study things like population studies and demography. From there, went to Indonesia as an advisor, a private NGO advisor to the government of Indonesia in their family planning program. I enjoyed that work because we were working with one of the most dynamic programs, family planning programs in the world, that received international acclamation for the work that it did in a peasant society that was not prepared to limit fertility. So I was working, doing a very nice job, and then UN came along, and the United Nations Population Fund, which was one of the agencies of the UN, came in and wanted to start a program in Indonesia. Indonesia was a success story. The UN wanted to be part of that success story. So they said, we'll start a program and we'll supply some support to you. So they started a program. Well, the UN doesn't have much of a reputation of hiring the best people in the world. They had a nice German woman who came, young woman. She came to our house often for dinner. She was always late coming. And I'd say, Petra, where have you been, for Pete's sakes? She said, oh, I've been busy in the office organizing the filing system. Well, I thought, Indonesia doesn't need a good filing system. Indonesia needs a good program that's going to support its national program. Anyway, the Indonesians decided Petra was not really helping them, and they asked for someone new. And in the UN system, jobs are advertised, presumably to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to apply for the job. But in fact, in most cases, the job has already been set aside for someone else. It was set aside for a very black Sudanese ambassador to Geneva, Monsieur Mahoub. Well, Monsieur Mahoub was the ambassador from what is it? Not Sierra Leone, but whatever, to Geneva. And he got the job as the director, as the executive director of the UN population program in Indonesia. Well, Mr. Mahoub knew nothing about population. Mr. Mahoub did not like Indonesia. It was too hot. From the Sudan to Indonesia, it's too hot. But his wife was a Bombay film star, and she was very beautiful. But she found it too hot. From Bombay to Jakarta was too hot. Give me a break. At any rate, Monsieur Mahoub did not like Indonesia and asked me to sort of run the program for him, which I did. I became the number 2. But I learned very quickly in the UN, unless you're number 1, you ain't nothing. You're the lowest person on the totem pole. And I was hired by the UN to assist Monsieur Mahoub in his programming. He had no idea what he was doing and why he was there, except to represent the United Nations as an ambassador. Well, so I was hired to help him. Helping him meant gopher. Jay, you go for this. Jay, you go for that. Jay, you go down and tell Mr. Rana. Mr. Rana was the head of the UN system in Indonesia, the number 1 person, that I, Monsieur Mahoub, an ambassador from the Sudan, and I will be addressed in the United Nations as Mr. Ambassador. Jay, go tell him that. So I go down and see Mr. Rana, and Mr. Rana, being a Nepalese and very unsure of himself, but going to project an image of authority, Mr. Rana, Mr. Mahoub would like to be addressed as Mr. Ambassador. No, it cannot be done. I am the head of the United Nations. I am the number 1. There is no other ambassador within the UN. Well, but Mr. Mahoub would like to have one of the vehicles come to his house in the morning and pick him up and bring him to the office. No. Only the head of the UN can have a vehicle to privately bring him to the office. You go tell Mr. Margot that he cannot do that. I go trotting back upstairs. Mr. Margot, Mr. Ron is not very supportive. Never mind. Well, this went on for about 2 years. And finally, Mr. Mahou got drawn away from Jakarta. He found paradise somewhere else in some other lovely hot country. And I was left in charge of this program. And I said, great, I'm going to become the director of the UN Population Fund in Indonesia. New York said, we have rules and regulations in the United Nations. No one can get promoted to a new position in the country in which he is already serving. You must leave the country, serve somewhere else, and then maybe we will appoint you as the representative. I said, okay, and I started looking around, and Korea was a good opportunity. So I thought, okay, we've got my family all excited about going to Korea. Suddenly got a telephone call from New York saying, the family planning program, the Indonesian program, has been concerned that you're going to leave Indonesia. They really would like you to stay in Indonesia, and they would like you to become the representative of the program in Indonesia. And I said, well, that's nice. But I thought you said I can't get promoted in this place. I have to go someplace else first. Oh, no, forget that. We'll make you representative. So I'm about the only representative who's ever been promoted to head up the office in the country in which I was working in a lower level position. Breaking the rules. Jay Parsons, breaking the rules. I became the head of the office. The UNFPA, the Fund for Population Activities, was established in the late 1960s at a time when UN agencies were proliferating. And each agency had its own board of governors, had its own regulations, had its own sort of procedures as to how it operates. Well, headquarters, UN headquarters in New York decided we can't have this kind of proliferation. We've got to centralize things and consolidate. So essentially they put the UNFPA under or within the program of the United Nations Development Program. There were several of us there. World Food Program was there. When we were there, a couple of other agencies were under the UNDP. So UNDP became the representative of this group of UN agencies. And as representative, I couldn't be representative because that indicated I was number one. But under this new system, UNDP was number one. So the resident representative in the UNDP was also representing these other groups. I was his deputy, which put me on an equal level with a deputy in the UNDP program. The deputy in the UNDP program didn't like that at all because he thought he was more important than me being deputy. So there was this constant battle, tug of war between deputies. And I was called the United Nations Deputy for Population Activities. Deputy for Development, Deputy for Population. But I was supposed to have equal rank. No. For about 10 years of my life, I spent fighting my colleagues in the United Nations to get equal representation, equal rights. We had a pouch system. We would have a pouch that would go from our office to New York, and we could put classified letters, and I often wrote to my executive director about our program, but it was classified. I didn't want it publicized. Well, UNDP decided I could only put a classified letter in that pouch if UNDP approved of the letter and approved of the contents of the letter. Well, I was having some problems with the leadership of UNDP, and I'd often write to my headquarters about how difficult it was being the deputy and not being recognized as important, what have you. And I put it in to the executive director of New York, of the program in New York, and I would get into a fight with the low-level UNDP person, said, you can't put that letter in this pouch. We have to have the resident representative read it and sign off on it. It's the only time in my career I shouted at some colleague in the UN. I said, put the letter in the pouch or I'm gonna run! The letter went in, but you know, it was a constant struggle to get my position recognized. Furthermore, being a member of the UNDP team, we were sort of considered not career people, but contract people. So we would get a 2-year contract to work with the UNFPA, not with the UNDP, but with the UNFPA. And every 2 years, I would have to go through a medical examination, clearing me health-wise for this new appointment as a contractor for the UNDP. And I tell you, we're living in Jakarta, Indonesia, which is not the healthiest place in the world. Living in Thailand, we're living in Asia where anything could happen. And if I didn't get that medical clearance, I was out. So it was a very stressful period. Every time my contract came up, we, the family and I, worried, am I going to get a new contract? Well, things work out. I fret a lot, but things work out and I got the contract. But it was this kind of insecurity and white-knuckle business that governed much of my early life within the UNFPA, within the UN office. One of the things that was very common, of course, with the UN, as I mentioned, no action, talk only, we had probably the most characteristic thing was meetings. We had meetings and meetings. We had meetings for meetings. We had meetings to prepare meetings. We had meetings to evaluate meetings. Seemed like I would get up in the morning and I had a full agenda of meetings. Some of these meetings were very interesting. They would be among our colleagues in the UN system. And you know, the UN is made up of a lot of different groups. You know, WHO, World Health Organization, is a UN agency. ILO, International Labor Organization, is a UN agency. UNESCO, UNICEF, all these are UN agencies. And the head of the UN team, the resident representative, was sort of the ambassador for all of these groups, all of these different groups working together. So our meetings would be as much with other representatives of other UN agencies. We would have meetings within our own organization. I had a fairly large program staff, people working, developing, monitoring programs for the government. We had meetings with other non-government organizations and groups. So meetings were very much part of our whole existence. I have a wonderful picture at home that shows me with the representative of the UN system holding one of these meetings. And he, in true form, is going on and on and on. The idea of putting a time limit on a meeting was not part of the UN system. So he was going on, and I've got this picture of me sort of hunkering down low, going like this to my watch, to David. David, you've got to stop. At any rate, meetings were our life. As the representative of the UNFPA, one of the major function that I had was really to identify a population, to work with the government, to identify what their population situation was. What was their need in terms of population? Was their population growing too slowly? Was their population growing too fast? Was their population too dispersed? And all of this, of course, was directed at economic development. How was population affecting the ability of the country to grow economically? When we started in 1969, this was the time of the population bomb, population explosion. Economists, the World Bank, were writing about the dangers of too rapid an increase in population compared to the economic development. So economic development in these newly independent countries was running about 3% a year. But the population growth was about 5 or 6% a year. So the growth of population was eating up all of the economic advances the country was making. So the UN Population Fund was created to assist governments identify what is their population problem, help them design a program that would address that particular issue, write a project of assistance, help the government implement that program, monitor the program in terms of its success. All our programs were successful, by the way. And, evaluate the results. That was my life, and that was fun. I really enjoyed working with governments. Couldn't, because we're an intergovernmental agency. The United Nations works with governments. We don't work with NGOs, with non-government organizations, unless we get special permission. So, I had fun working with governments, and I was a good programmer. I would sit and listen to government. I studied the language so they could speak to me in Bahasa Indonesia. I would listen to them and I'd say, okay, what is it you're trying to accomplish? How is it that we can use the limited resources of the UN to assist you in achieving those goals? It was very rewarding, very rewarding. And governments appreciated the fact that we were there not to tell them how to do it, which was often the case with other donors. They would come in and say, you've got this problem. Here, we'll provide you with this money, these people, and this is what you have to do and how you have to do it. UN, at least in my program, we did not take that approach. We said, what do you want to do? How can we help you? And that was particularly liked by the international community. We, in addition to the programming, we would represent the fund as part of the UN team to the host country and to international organizations. You see here, I'm talking on the left, on the right-hand side, in front of a group in Bangladesh in some international meeting that we had. On the other side, we're talking to Vietnam, and I'm representing the UN FPA in that particular program. And in the bottom, we've got a bunch of UN heads of agencies from a regional team in Bangkok, and I'm a member of that team explaining what it is that the UNFPA is trying to do. I mentioned at one point the idea of working with different UN agencies to bring about collaboration. Now, each agency of the UN feels that it is the most important agency in the United Nations system. And each agency is trying, for some reason, to expand its mandate as far as possible. Our biggest competitor was UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. We're here to protect children. Okay, fine, children need protection. But we're going to provide assistance to parents who want to have more children or want to have less children. But wait, that's that's the mandate of the UNFPA. That's my mandate. We're to provide population assistance. Like, no, we will do it. We will do it. Let's see, what else? We had UNICEF, ILO. We're dealing with labor, and we want to do this with labor. And I'd say, well, look, you've got labor unions. You're working with labor. We could get in there, work with you to provide information to your labor unions about the importance of limiting family size for the health of mothers and children. Oh, well, we don't do that kind of work. We work with labor. Okay, look, there are opportunities, guys, to piggyback onto what your program is doing, that we can help you and you can help us. And this is all UN collaboration is supposed to be. UNFPA, UNDP, ILO, UNESCO are all different agencies, and we could work together to achieve a common goal. No. Kofi Annan, who was our executive director or the Secretary General of the United Nations, in the 90s, set about the task of trying to reorganize the United Nations and bring the various agencies together to work together. And this probably dominated most of the work that I did until I retired in 2000, bringing these different agencies together to harmonize our program. You would think that this would be a fairly easy task, but I tell you, it was impossible. Talk about prima donnas. Every one of these organizations felt that they were the most important UN representative in town. Their car should carry the UN flag when they drive down the street. No, only the representative carries the UN flag, the country coordinator. At any rate, the whole issue of collaboration has sort of gone by the way. It hasn't worked. It can't work the way the UN is established. Do you know that WHO, for example, has its own board of governors. It has its own charter. It has its own objectives spelled out. And these were done at the end of World War II when we were trying to help the international community with international health problems. So it made sense then. But now, it makes a lot less sense. They should be working with other countries. There's a lot of criticism about WHO and the pandemic because WHO was rather slow about identifying the coronavirus. What most people don't understand is that WHO has no independent mandate of its own. It can only go into a country if that country requests it to come in. So it can't just go into China and look to see what the problem is with coronavirus. It has to have the approval of the Chinese government. If I got sick in Jakarta and I wanted to be evacuated to Singapore to get health clearance, I would have to have WHO approval for that evacuation to Singapore. Well, WHO is not going to give approval because it would put shame on the country that it's working in. It would be admitting that Indonesia does not have the medical capacity to take care of me. So you can't say that Indonesia is not capable if you're WHO, because WHO is Indonesia. This is one of the problems that continues in the UN system. Oops. There we go. Another function of the UNFPA, or the UN bureaucrat, is pleasing the boss, keeping the boss happy. There were only two bosses in the UNFPA in the 21-year period that I served. The first boss was a Filipino, who had been in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Deputy Foreign Minister, I think. This was the time of Magsaysay, Foreign Minister Magsaysay of the Philippines. Magsaysay was a weirdo in the sense that he liked to go around the world, and in every country that he visited, he wanted an honorary doctorate. So Magsaysay had an enormous list of honorary doctorates. Mr. Salas, Rafael Salas, who became executive director from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, decided he wanted to have an honorary doctorate from every country he visited. And that was the whole point of his visiting the country, was to get the honorary doctorate. Never mind whatever our program was, which I don't think he understood anyway. But he wanted an honorary doctorate. Well, when I was in Indonesia, I was told by New York that I must go to the Ministry of Education in Indonesia and get them to award Mr. Salas an honorary doctorate. So I went to the Ministry of Education, and the Minister of Education said, absolutely not. No, we do not give honorary doctorates. So I reported this back to headquarters. And said, I don't think he's going to be able to get it. Well, I didn't realize the influence that headquarters could have on making local decisions. They manipulated, and they maneuvered, and they finally got approval for Mr. Salas's honorary doctorate, but the Minister of Education was not approving it, and he was not going to have anything to do with it. So when Mr. Salas came to Indonesia and received his honorary doctorate, the Minister of Education was not present in that ceremony. Someone had contacted the President of Indonesia, President Suharto. Suharto instructed the ministry, you give Mr. Salas his honorary doctorate. So Salas had. This is the kind of thing that we had to put up with quite frequently. The second administrator or executive director was a woman from Pakistan, Dr. Nafis Sadiq. Now she was a professional. She was a program person. She had been working in family planning in Pakistan. And she was a very determined woman who came from a society that did not value women. In fact, if there was a fire at home, you saved the cow first before you saved the wife. She came from that background, but she was tough as nails with men. She had a number of Pakistani men working for her in headquarters. Every time she would call a meeting of these men, my boss was one of those Pakistani people, I could see them, their hands were sweating, they were pale, and they were going into this meeting with Dr. Sadiq, who could have said anything and made them do anything, and they would have had to crawl on the road to get out. She was that kind of a person. She was a wonderful person. She loved Americans, fortunately. But she would come to visit. The amount of time that was spent preparing for a visit of the executive director of UNFPA. We had to line up this ceremony, this event. We had to provide her with speeches for each of one of these things. We had to get food. We didn't have a budget for this sort of thing. A lot of it came out of our own pocket. We had a little bit of entertainment money, but nothing on the order. In Bangkok, I took her out on the river. We had a reception on the river in Bangkok. It was a beautiful affair, catered, what have you. I had to pay for most of it because we didn't have the funds to do that. She came to Bangladesh and talked to a group of girls who were getting educated, had received their diplomas, and she was going to address the girls. And we got there, and I hadn't prepared a speech for her because I figured if anyone could talk to Bangladeshi girls about education and the importance of education, it would have been Dr. Sadiq. So I don't have to give her something to say to these girls. Well, she did fine. She did exactly what I knew she could do. But afterwards, my goodness gracious, Jay, where was my speech? I loved the UN, but it was a white-knuckle affair. We were also responsible for signing international documents. In this picture, I'm working with the government of Laos to provide them with a program. This is probably my most successful program that I had. It's a very small program. We got the government to do a census. They had never in the history of, excuse me, never in the history of Laos had they had a national census. So in 1983, UNFPA gave assistance to the government of Laos to conduct its first national census. Well, a national census is a major international or national undertaking, and a lot of assistance is required, from vehicles to paper for the questionnaires to salaries for the workers. All of this stuff has to be worked out in a project proposal. We worked with the government of Laos, and the man in the middle of the left-hand picture is the most ranking member of the Planning Bureau of Laos. Laos is a communist country, and he was the head of the Planning Bureau, which is a very, very important position. So he's signing this document with the UNFPA to provide a certain amount of assistance. We had a table, and we had the Lao side of the table with the Lao flag, and the UN side of the table with the UN flag, and we get up and we shake hands and we get our pictures taken. And this is all part of what we do in terms of international cooperation. A lot of training. My job, many UNFPA directors of countries, heads of programs in countries, are more interested in representing, the representative kinds of things. They like to participate in UN parties and meet other diplomats and hobnob with the high society, etc. Those of us like me were more program-oriented. We're not so much interested in that ceremonial kind of thing. We were more interested in seeing results in our population program. So as a result, many of us would be involved in training. And I did a lot of training, particularly in Indonesia, where Indonesian was my language. I spoke it pretty well. And so I would have a meeting and we'd sit with government staff who were running our projects. And I'd explain to them what was necessary in terms of requesting assistance from us, getting the money they needed, in terms of reporting the results of what they were doing. And so we'd have this meeting, and it would all be pretty much in Indonesian. I finished one of these training sessions, and I said, well, are there any questions? No questions, no questions. I said, that's such a relief. It's so good to know that my Indonesian is so good that you understood everything I said. My program officer, Indonesian fellow, sat next to me and whispered to me, Jay, your Indonesian wasn't all that good, but we did understand you. They keep you honest, that's for sure. And let's see, what else we got here? Oh, wrong direction. Yes. Meeting with government representatives, high-ranking government representatives. Picture on the right, meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand. And I forget what the occasion was, but we were briefing him on some work that we were doing for the Thai government, usually in the hill tribes or in the opium growing areas. The second picture is meeting with President Suharto and his wife Ibu Tien, who was president of Indonesia. And, and this is my favorite picture. This one I've had up on my wall, my den, of me briefing President Suharto in the early 1990s. President Suharto's interpreter sitting next to him, between me and the president, the French ambassador to my left, and my colleague from the Indonesian Family Planning Program in the traditional dress. And I am briefing President Suharto on a project that the French government and the UN has designed to help their population program. It was exhilarating because afterwards, when we were just informally talking, the interpreter said to me, "You didn't need my assistance at this at all. You did very well." So I was very pleased, and this was really one of the highlights of my experience overseas. The fun part, the really fun part of my job, was going into the provinces, into the field, with the projects that we had developed. And as the representative of the UNFPA, I was responsible for being able to report on the progress of these projects. And so, in the upper left-hand corner, I'm sitting with our project manager in northern Thailand, in the Hill Tribes area, where we're trying to build a program to provide family planning services to Hill Tribes. And the Hill Tribes were dispersed. So we needed some mechanism to get to these villages to provide services. And we're sitting talking with the village elders about that. We spent a week walking through the jungles, through the mountains of northern Thailand, the Golden Triangle, to get to all of the villages for these meetings. Stan, who's in there somewhere, my project manager, and I are still very close friends. In fact, I sent an email to him this morning telling him what I'm doing today in terms of my lecture. Picture in the bottom and to the left, we were in Laos, and the government was taking me around to show me what they were doing following the census for the family planning program. And we had to go into all of these little villages and see the headman and talk to them. Well, every stop that we made, we had to imbibe in this awful, awful rice wine that they would brew in these containers. And we had big straws, and we had to suck it up. Well, I have never been quite so tipsy as I was after this visit to the field. But it was great. It was fun. We got to meet the people. We got to talk to the people. We got to see what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it. That was the fun part of my job. Finally, we also lived as family people. I had my wife and 2 kids with me. My kids entered and graduated from the international schools in Thailand, in Jakarta, in Bangladesh. My wife was involved in working at the museum as a volunteer. I was teaching or training sports, working in soccer and t-ball with my son, doing Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts with my family, going to church on Sunday, just a regular kind of life, trying to keep our kids involved in what would be an American way of living, without overdoing it, without prejudice, without rancor. And to this day, my kids still, one in London, England, one in Kalamazoo, thank me for the opportunity that they had to grow up overseas and to see that the world is not black or white, but variation of gray. And to be judgmental in that world is a great mistake. At one point, before I left Thailand in 1985, I was the director of the Bangkok Music Society. We had our involvement in that community, in the communities in which we lived. We were not isolated, confined to our own little UN community, but we tried to live in the larger community. So at any rate, I've said some things about the UN that are unflattering, but they're true. They are true. But, as someone said, if there were no United Nations, we would have to invent one, because there is so much that the UN does that cannot be done by individual governments. So So I am proud of the fact that I worked for the UN, that I was able to do pretty much what I wanted to do. It was very important. I started out as number 2 in the office, and I was a gopher. I ended up very shortly as the head of the office. And I could do pretty much what I wanted to do in terms of trying to be of assistance to governments. It was a very rewarding career. I don't miss it. I'm very happy to be here in Friendship Village in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Thank you. Please, questions?
Jay?
And I speak Indonesian so well you understood everything I said?
Jay, how did you get to Kalamazoo?
How did I get to Kalamazoo? I was living, after Mom died in 2008, I decided there was nothing keeping me in the U.S., and I'd rather go back to the part of the world I love most, which was Asia. I went back to Indonesia for 5 years, got tired of the crowds in Indonesia, so I went up to northeast Thailand, where someone recommended me at a university to work with young faculty people in helping them write their international journal papers. After a couple of years of that, I decided, I've had enough. I have time to go home and figure out what I want to do when I get old. 2018, and then when I come home every summer, and I'd visit Allison here in Kalamazoo, and she introduced me to the church, and she introduced me to their friends, and Fletcher, my grandson's schoolmates, etc. And I got kind of a warm feeling about Kalamazoo, despite the fact that I had done my postdoctorate in Ann Arbor and decided then I was never going to live in Michigan again. I used to drive to my wife's family in Illinois, and the whole way was cloudy and rainy until we went south into Indiana and the sun came out. I said, no, I'm not living there. Anyway, it grew on me. I had a choice of either living close to my brother in North Carolina, where I had lived for 8 years, or moving to Kalamazoo. My brother's got more problems than I do, so he wasn't going to be much help. Allison is my help, so here I am. With my Poopsie. I don't know whether you know Poopsie. Poopsie is my little dog, who's very sweet and very affectionate, and she makes my life happy.
Question over from Nancy.
What do you think about the United Nations today? Are they being very useful? And also, how have they been involved in the pandemic? Since it seems like they could be very helpful with trying to get the whole world.
Right. They continue, the two main functions of the UN are peacekeeping and development. So it's divided. Peacekeeping, there's still much activity on the part of the UN peacekeepers intervening in situations that are militarily unstable because they're supposedly neutral. They don't take either side. So they go in and they serve as a buffer between the warring factions. So the peacekeeping aspects of the UN continue. They're not without problems, but generally speaking, they serve a very useful purpose. In terms of the pandemic, again, WHO is the lead organization within the UN for health issues. Now, one of the things WHO has done has been to establish an international group to which individual countries can contribute vaccines. And the UN then takes the responsibility for distributing those vaccines. And again, it's on a neutral basis. No one country gets favored over another country. Besides which, WHO has sent in teams to China to try to determine what caused this problem and how to prevent it in the future. David? Oh, come on, I know you can shout.
So Jay, it seems to me that being involved with the UN, you have been exposed to things about the world that most of the rest of us are never exposed to and don't know much about. And you're now retired. So my question has to do, if you walked away, to what extent walk away? And to what extent are you currently informed about all those things that the rest of us are not?
Well, when I first retired in 2000, I had 3 or 4 years of independent consultancies. I was working mostly for the U.S. government, USAID, in their HIV/AIDS program. So I kept very much involved. In every country I visited on those consultancies, I would visit the UNFPA office and see what they were doing. After that, I must admit, I haven't kept up with much of anything in terms of what I used to do. This picture that was up here about me with the hill tribes in northern Thailand with Stan Zenkel, my good friend. He keeps me very much informed as to what he's doing to try to promote family planning services in Burma, of all places. I was in New York on Sunday for the memorial service for a former roommate of mine, and I saw all these people on the street. I saw dogs, I saw cars, I saw taxis, I saw bicycles, I saw noise, I saw dirt, I saw bags of garbage that are going to be picked up next morning by garbage trucks at 4 o'clock in the morning that go back up the whole damn way, beep, 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 beep. Awful. I sat there drinking my coffee, thinking, I'm so glad I'm in Kalamazoo. I do keep a little bit up in the sense I teach English as a second language through the Kalamazoo Literacy Council, and it's virtual, but it works out very well. I have a very good group of learners. They're older, their English is better, so we have an opportunity to discuss a wide variety of political and international kinds of issues. And so in order to keep up with that, I am constantly, well, I'm also a news junkie. I watch too much MSNBC and not enough Fox News. But you know, so essentially I'm taking life a lot easier than I did. And it's refreshing.
Now from the other Dunstone over here.
Oh, another Dunstone.
Jay, I had no idea that when you and I decided to, well, we didn't decide, I think we were mandated to do a sex education class in our church, that you had all this professional thing about family planning. I should have had you do it all. It was a delight, but I would guess too, when I think about it, people say sex education in church, what are you talking about? But that's the safest place, I think, to learn, right? To learn about that. Yeah, anyway, it was fun, but it got cut short with a little germ. But yeah, you should have done it all. I didn't know you had all that experience.
Well, it's true, Deb, that I, in my retirement, I try to do things that keep my mind active and going. When I was approached by Sarah Schmidt-Lee at church to join a training program for teaching sex education, I thought, why not? Let's do it and see what that results in. You say I was working all this time in family planning, but I tell you, the things I didn't know about sex education that I was learning from these high school kids in this class was amazing.
It's probably harder.
It was hard, but it was fun, and unfortunately COVID has screwed that up.
Yeah. Well, I only knew you as Allison's dad and Fletcher's grandpapa. No, you were all this.
It's time for lunch.
Thank you, Greg.
I sat here marveling at the breadth of complexity that Jay's experience has had. It's just been unbelievable. If any of you have been a part of institutions and organizations where there tends to be a sort of a built-in bureaucracy, I think Jay described it well this morning in terms of all the complexities. It's always a challenge when you're dealing with an institutional setting where there's purpose, a goal, and an objective, and successes. And at the same time, there are all of these intricacies that are going on, and the competition between various parts of that is real. So you've sort of perhaps enlightened us even more about the good things and a little bit of the difficulties in the journey. But thank you, Jay. That's very, very helpful. The first Wednesday in November will be our next Tall Tales. We are still working on the program, otherwise I would tell you what it is, but we will announce that soon. But we do have several people that are ready and willing to step up and continue this program month after month. So we look forward to seeing you again around the village, but also on the first Wednesday of November again, right here for the next Tall Tales. Thanks for coming this morning.